In this video, I'm going to talk to you about preparing to go into prison. Specifically, we'll discuss how you approach the work. In the last video, we discussed how the program approaches the work in our attempt to produce quality college education within the context of CDCR. And in this video, I'd like to talk about how you personally approach the work as you teach college courses within the Department of Corrections. So we'll start by talking about the context and culture of prisons. Now, this is going to be super fast. We could talk at length, you could take entire classes, entire degrees, right, on the culture of prisons. But I want to make it clear that the context and the culture matters. You are teaching in a prison. Sometimes faculty, I think, want to, we need to hold that tension that we are inside of the prison. We are inside of the prison industrial complex. We're working with people that have been convicted of committing crimes, and that we are also working with people who have come through this system, which we know is inherently classist and racist. We know that we are working with students who have diverse intersectional identities. And we know that that is true for the employees of CDCR. There's a lot going on in the prison context. So with that going on, we also know that there are many tensions, nuances that we are navigating within the work that we do as we teach in prison. So one key aspect of the culture of education, ideally, is that we are rooted in humanism, and that one of our goals is that people will grow cognitively, transformatively through the work of education. And we hope that this occurs on campus as well as for students who are incarcerated. A key aspect of the culture of prison is control and punishment. So how do you have these two cultures embedded in one another, working with each other, and yet one, the culture of college, that's us, is required to the only way we can be there is if that other culture allows us to be there. Let me be clear, these are not the only cultures that are at play here, but this is a key aspect of what happens. And so as faculty go in, we all make some level of compromises. And so what I encourage us to do is to be clear about what compromises we're making, what compromises we're willing to make as we work within these conflicting cultures. And when we feel tension and we feel conflict, we feel something that doesn't feel quite right, that we spend some time thinking about, talking about, accessing support and collaboration to help us with that. So one of the things that we talk about as one of our grounding principles or aspirations is to dignify everyone, so that we dignify, acknowledge, recognize, honor, respect the humanity of all, regardless of their past or present behavior. And at times this causes tension, whether that tension is in students, whether that tension is in fellows, people that we work with, whether that tension is between the correction officers and the students. We will feel times where we have a hard time maybe honoring or respecting those that we work with. So how do you do this? Well, I want to encourage you to acknowledge and consider your humanity and the humanity of everyone that you work with as you're confronted with making challenging decisions, as you're confronted with exhaustion, as you're confronted with how to prepare for classes. Step back into and remember your humanity. As you're confronted with understanding the cultural differences that exist within the classroom, don't be tempted to believe that they're not there just because someone's human experience is different than yours. Instead, engage in empathy to understand the ways in which different human beings and their different cultural identities experience the world different than you do. So attend to those differences. Okay, so that might be kind of abstract for some of you that don't teach in the social sciences. So I want to be real concrete. As a program during the pandemic, we met weekly during Zoom, And we had many conversations, and one of those conversations was about people first language. So according to state and national recommendations, we wanted to make sure we aligned to those recommendations to use people first language. As a program, we avoid the use of words like felons, prisoners, or felons and inmates. Instead, we like to use words like students or people who are incarcerated, people who live in prison. This is our recommendation. Now, this can be a little challenging because our partners that we work with, our educational partners, the Department of Corrections, they will use the word inmate. And so I encourage all of you to begin to use the word student. It's a very good, easy way that we as community college professors can refer to and think of the people that we work with as students who live at the various facilities that we teach at. So authority and power, this is another area of tension and of nuance, and one of the conflictual, or one of the areas of conflict that we negotiate in the prison ed classroom. So the first recommendation I have is don't ignore that authority and power are playing out in the classroom. I was having a conversation over the pandemic in a certain venue, and a faculty member said, like, this isn't really playing out in the classroom. Like, everyone is very respectful. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I've had other conversations with faculty across time where they've been hesitant to use the authority that they innately have in the classroom to address concerns that they have in the classroom. But remember, you do have innate authority. You give grades, you write the syllabus, you decide how class is used. These are all aspects of your authority. How are you going to use power in the classroom? Sometimes people are like, well, we'll all just kind of get along. In the prison classroom, if you check your power and authority at the door, someone will pick it up. And I would say that happens on campus as well, but it's definitely going to happen in the prison classroom. And if someone picks that power and authority up, it may not be used toward the good of whatever you are trying to establish as your educational norms or for education, for learning in the classroom. So I want to give you some specific ways that you can start to think about authority and power in the classroom. One, be aware of your expertise. So what are you an expert in? What skills do you have? That may be knowledge. That would be your experience. You have it. Bring it to the classroom. What is your role? You know your role as an instructor, but how does that change in the prison classroom? You're going to know and continue to learn that as you gain expertise, as you transfer your skills into the prison classroom. Know what you know and know what you don't know. So you don't have to know everything, right? This is where the authenticity, curiosity, flexibility come in. You don't have to know everything, but when you don't know it, find it out. So this is a way that we model co-learning, and co-learning is a way that we use power for the good of learning. So here's another big tension with authority and power. As you listen to this video and the next video, I'm going to talk a lot about boundaries. And as you negotiate boundaries, as you hold boundaries in the classroom, as you keep boundaries and establish boundaries in the classroom, you still want to remain curious and flexible. How do you do that? My guess is you already do that. So I encourage you to think about how you do that. And yet you hold that tension, having boundaries and remaining curious and flexible. When to be flexible, when to be inflexible. That's one of the tensions of the art of teaching, and it's very important in the prison classroom. So how about authenticity and collaboration? I put those ones both together. But what about, I want to marry authenticity with safety. So if we go back to that original diagram that you all have seen often, I think I have it on the next slide, so I'll flip to it real quick. What you'll see in this diagram is the idea that these grounding ideas underneath here are also embedded with these topics of safety, student support, and the self of the professor. And I gotta figure out how to get this thing to let me go back because it doesn't want to let me go back. Boom, there we go. All right, so when we talk about being your authentic self, learning to be your authentic self, transforming into your authentic self as a professor, you can only be the professor that you are in the classroom. And yet, if you've not taught in the prison classroom, you don't necessarily know who you are in the prison classroom as a professor. So you're growing into that, you're co-learning. And the students may not know who they are as college students in the classroom. And none of us know necessarily who we are coming out of this pandemic. We're all growing and transforming and co-learning. So there is this tension, right, of the ongoing understanding and discovery of self and our authenticity. And at the same time in the prison, the idea of safety becomes key as we hold these pieces together. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. One aspect of authenticity is who you are as a person as it relates to your culture, the way that the values you have, your traditions, your beliefs, your worldview, and how that is similar or different than the students that you work with. This is true on campus. This is true in the prison. Don't negate the cultural differences. Acknowledge them, learn how to make space for these authentic similarities and differences in culture. Do not ignore them. Too often people say, like, I don't see race because I don't experience the way that race happens, or I don't see gender because gender is not a big deal in my life, or I don't see like attraction or sexual orientation because that's not a big deal in my life. It all plays out for someone often in the classroom. So please don't ignore that. Next piece is protect your identity. Remember, you are teaching in a prison. There is no need for people to know personal information about where you live, how you got to the prison, the names of your family members, where you physically specifically go on vacation. These things are not important. So you can be vague and still provide the context that students understand. There's a few examples that I could give of this. So one example is like when I introduce myself in classes, I always provide at the beginning of the semester, like my professional like areas of expertise, almost like a CV, right? So students have a sense of like who I am and what my background is. And I will be clear like that I've spent a lot of time in the Midwest, right? I taught high school in the greater Detroit area. I don't have to tell them exactly where I taught in Michigan, right? I can still give them the context like it was across the other part of the country without telling them exactly the city, exactly the name of the high school. On campus, I might do that. I still don't know that I need to, but I might. When you're telling a story, you know, for one, why do you tell stories in your class? Please be intentional about examples that you share in your class, and then be intentional about the information that you provide. I'll give an example. I watched someone do this one time. So at the end of the time that students who are taking social work, human service courses in the prison, at the end of their time with us, they provide, or we do a completer ceremony after they've taken the certificate, which is the courses for the major. And we invite people in Los Rios to these completer ceremonies. So on a yard at Mule Creek State Prison before the pandemic, Jamie Nye came and he spoke. He's our Vice Chancellor of Instruction in Los Rios. So he spoke. So the way these ceremonies go is that the students talk about their experience in taking like all of these classes. They have like 33 units they complete in the major plus a bunch of GE courses. So they talk about their experience taking classes and the projects that they completed for internship. So the students all talked. One particular group talked about this parenting group. They created and delivered a parenting group for other students who were incarcerated. And as Jamie, after the students all did their presentations, Jamie and I comes up to give statements to the students. So the Vice Chancellor of Instruction is coming up and he's kind of making some final remarks to the students as we finish the completer ceremony. And he connects to the students by making a response to one of the presentations, specifically the presentation by the parenting group. And before he makes his prepared remarks, he says this. He says, I am the Vice Chancellor of Instruction. Okay, so this is my memory of what was said. So this is close to what was said. I'm the Vice Chancellor of Instruction for this community college district. My wife is a nurse. My teenage daughter only cares about makeup. I think I need to go to your parenting group. This is a perfect example about what I'm talking about. He didn't share where his daughter goes to school. He didn't tell us where his office is in Los Rios. He didn't talk about how long his wife has been a nurse. He did not talk about where his wife is a nurse. He didn't do any of that. Instead, what he did was he gave us enough information so that the point of what he was saying, which was, wow, I really respect your parenting group. It sounds really useful. I could even use it, right? He gave us enough context to be able to connect to the students. That's what I mean. Protect your identity, be authentic, be intentional with examples, and then just be careful about anything that's too private about your identity. So the other thing is that very specifically use professional titles. And some people feel some kind of way about this, but I encourage you to do this. When we're not there in the prison, the students are talking about our classes. So they'll talk about, for example, in the class, on campus, I go by Kalinda in my classes. In the prison, I go by Dr. Jones. So when I'm not there, the students could be like, yeah, in Dr. Jones's class, we were talking about da 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 da. That's very different than in Kalinda's class, or Kalinda said, Dr. Jones said da 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 da. Very, very different when the correction officers or the captains or whoever on the yard is hearing about what's going on in our classes. It has implications for the program. Their perception of what's going on in our classes may be different than what's really going on, but the use of the titles, the use of like, oh, they're talking about a professor versus they're just, what are they talking about? Why are they calling their professor by their first name? It does have implications for our program, for your class, and for the perception that what's going on in your class is what the prison would call overfamiliar, or that it's not professional enough. So please use your professional title. It can be very uncomfortable for people, but as a program, we ask that you do that. So we also want to all right, so I am continuing our recording, and I was discussing the need to use professional titles. The other thing I wanted to talk about was being thoughtful of how you address students. You're going to want to spend some time thinking about the way in which you address students, whether you use titles or their first names, avoiding monikers, which would be nicknames, for various reasons that you want to avoid that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So as you work to be your authentic self, grow into your authentic self, and you work with students as they're growing into their authentic self, please remember to be careful and aware and safe, and to hold the tension between authenticity and safety as you are teaching in the prison environment. And we're doing all this together, right? We're all learning, we all need each other, and working within a collaborative community, staying humble and curious and flexible. These are the ways in which that we approach the work so that we can be more effective for ourselves and for students. So I'd like to give you an example that I hope brings together all of these aspects in this chart that shows one way to approach the work. So in spring to fall of 2016, I started teaching in the prisons, in California in spring of 2016. Previously, I had taught in Indiana in prisons. And in the spring of 2016 through the fall of 2016, I was calling students by their last name. This is what the people that worked in the prison called students, so that I just assumed the norm that was there, and I called students by their last name. In November of 2016, I attended the National Conference on Higher Ed and Prisons, and I learned that the recommendation was to call students by their first names. that people found it to be offensive to call people by their last names. It was incredibly humanizing to be called by first names. And I was kind of torn. I came home and I was like, wow. Well, actually, not even before I came home. When I was there, I was like, am I doing harm? I don't know what to do. Our partners really, they've recommended that I call people by their last names. I talk all about over familiarity. And the prison says, like, it's a boundary if you call people by their first names. And so I was like, I really don't know what to do. I want to treat people as humans. I want to honor, like, dignifying people. I want to be authentic to myself. I want to work collaboratively with our partners. I work within CDCR, as this diagram shows, and yet I want to do what's right for the colleges. And I was really torn. I was not really sure what to do. But in the class I was teaching, I was at that point in the semester where I was teaching the ethical decision making. That's one of the things that we teach in social work human service courses. And I was teaching that. And so the students, I presented this to them. And I asked them to take this ethical dilemma that I was experiencing through the ethical decision making model. Now, the cool part about this is that they all reach different conclusions. That's how an ethical decision making model in social work, human services, and applied psychology, it works. You won't always come to the same conclusion. Well, individuals won't all come to the same conclusion. What they will come to, or what they will do, is go through a process with reasons and support for whatever conclusion they have. So I read through all of this different students' recommendations, their reasoning, the sources that they appealed to. So in the ethical decision making model, you look at outside sources to help you make your decision. And the students brought in lots of different sources. I learned tons of different things. They brought in opinions, they brought in personal experiences, they brought in policy, Department of Corrections policy. I learned lots of things in having them do this. And what I concluded ultimately was that it was best for the program and our collaborative relationship with our partners, and it still was respectful of students and honored them if I used titles, if I used Mr., Ms., Mrs., and students' last names. So I personally do not use first names in my classes. I tell students, I will call you by Mr., Ms., Mrs., whatever you prefer, and then I will use your last name. And then I ask that you call me Dr. Jones, and that we use that kind of professional titles in this setting. That works for me. Not every student wanted that, right, in their ethical decision-making model, but that is what works for me. It worked for me then, and that's what I plan to continue to do. In the future, maybe I will change that. What I wanted to use this example as a way that it considers dignifying, respecting, and honoring everyone's humanity. It illustrates how I used authority in my classroom. It was my authentic process that I went through. I wanted to share that with you. And we're all going through authentic processes of learning and figuring out how can you work through the dilemmas and the tensions you experience in your classroom. How do you do that, right? And come out and feel like you can do it in a way that works for you. And I did it collaboratively. I did it collaboratively with students. And I also did it in light of the collaboration that we have with our partners in the Department of Corrections. So in this presentation, I talked to you about attending to the context and the culture of prison, and about continuing to learn, approach the work by honoring the dignity of all human beings, by attending to authority and power, authenticity, and collaboration. And there are a series of questions in this video that I encourage you to think about, that when we get together as a group, we will talk about